Good day, dear friends. Today we will talk about one of the most famous rulers, perhaps of all time and all nations. What is interesting is that she made the journey from an illegitimate, despised and constantly fearful princess who was aided by her advisors and whose opinions were disregarded, to a revered queen, an object of national admiration, and a monarch with absolute power. I decided to start with this controversial ruler for a reason, as my mother, a historian, named me after Elizabeth Tudor, and literally from childhood she instilled in me a love for history, which I sincerely want to share with you today. Thus, the prosperity of England under Elizabeth Tudor was, of course, not without its challenges. The contrasts of wealth and poverty were very great, and yet her name became a national symbol. She loved to live lavishly, adored luxury, balls, dances, and travels, including those with her favorites, while her people often went hungry. Nevertheless, she was nicknamed Good Queen Bess, the English Queen Elizabeth Tudor, or the Great Queen of the 16th century. In fact, even the Golden Age of England is referred to as her reign. And this is the time when the English Navy is expanding, when English colonies are being established, and when daring pirates fight in glory for their queen. Of course, Shakespeare and many other great playwrights write about it. And it is simply impossible not to talk about this queen. Her path to the throne, to put it frankly, was not easy, but to begin with, she might never have been born at all. In 1533, Henry VIII, who is famous for having 6 wives, divorces his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and passionately desiring love and, of course, sons, marries the young and ambitious Anne Boleyn, who refuses to share the king's bed without an official marriage. And this divorce was not easy for him, as a divorce could only be obtained with the permission of the Pope, who at that time was under significant pressure from the great Spanish king, who was also Emperor Charles V. After all, Catherine of Aragon is Charles V's aunt, so he absolutely does not want such a public insult to be inflicted on his family. And the Pope, under pressure, is not granting permission for the divorce. And then Henry VIII declares that he will become the head of the church in England, and thus he will grant himself the permission for divorce. This story can be told on one hand as a personal drama of Henry VIII, but on the other hand, it is certainly not just about the drama. Henry VIII never hid his imperial ambitions, and for complete power he also needed authority over the church. And so, this was a fortunate moment, as after the Pope's refusal to grant a divorce, Henry VIII declared himself the head of the Church of England, gaining unlimited power. He quickly dissolved all monasteries, seized their properties, and then sold them into private hands. In other words, he kind of nationalized the wealthiest estate, put it up for auction, and was very pleased with himself. After all, why not? Now no one could tell him what to do. Henry literally adores Anne, calling her his beloved and cherished one. He writes deeply heartfelt letters to her. For her sake, he sacrifices his closest advisor, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. He severs all ties with the Vatican, changes the religion of an entire country, as we have already mentioned, and sends us the shameful execution of his beloved mentor and Lord Chancellor Thomas More, which it seems he could never truly forgive her for deep down. For all the sacrifices made in the name of Anne becoming queen, he expected from her a much-desired male heir who would please him. She gave birth to Elizabeth. Henry was so confident that he and Anne would have a boy, that he had already chosen names for him, Edward Henry, and ordered dozens of letters to foreign rulers from the court to be prepared in advance, which would of course mention that the Queen had given birth to a prince. When it became clear that the baby was a girl, all the letters had to be hastily rewritten. The prince needed to be replaced with a princess, but there wasn't enough space to write the word in full. And so, before even entering the world, the future Queen Elizabeth Tudor was already considered a second child and became a disappointment to her father. After all, if he had known that this girl would become the greatest ruler of England, perhaps he would have been reassured, but he was, of course, expecting a boy. And then he cools towards Catherine and thinks that he urgently needs another wife. In my opinion, this is an absolutely phenomenal solution to a family conflict. If the wife is not pleasing, off with her head, and let's quickly find a new wife. And so Anne Boleyn is accused of treason, and treason against the husband king is considered treason against the state, treason against the country, and she is put on trial. It seems that all the witness testimonies were given under torture, and it appears that she was not guilty of anything at all, but who cares? Naturally, this does not stop anyone. She is sentenced to death. And here it is important to note that she became one of the few who faced execution within the walls of the tower, and this was a significant achievement, for in such moments there are no mockeries from the crowd, no humiliating glances. Only a close priest was nearby. Moreover, Henry VIII agreed to yet another special request from his wife, a small mercy, but still it was something to execute her, not by sword, but by axe, as was done in England. And this was considered a quicker and less painful method of execution. So, on the day of her execution, Anne Boleyn went out to the Tower courtyard and addressed all those present, speaking worthy words and asking them to pray for the king. She reaffirmed her innocence once more before her head rolled across the ground. At that time she was only 36, and her daughter was just over 2.5. How was she to live on? Although the king did not disown his daughter, a special decision was initially passed through Parliament declaring her illegitimate, which was later revoked. However, it still emphasized the illegality of his marriage to Anne Boleyn. But in any case, it did not change the fact that Henry remained the head of the Church of England and kept all his wealth for himself. Here, of course, it is very convenient for him. Henry VIII generally hoped that his only son Edward, who was born in 1537 to the king's next wife Jane Seymour, would live a long life. But just in case, he specified the order of succession to the crown through his daughters Mary and Elizabeth in his will. In the event that Edward dies without leaving heirs, each of the girls will take turns claiming the right to the throne, but only on the condition that she may lose this right if she marries a man whom certain members of the Privy Council do not approve. Edward grows up strong and healthy, but at the age of 15 he contracts measles, and apparently his immune system cannot withstand it. On July 6, 1553, he dies of tuberculosis. It is very important for us to note that Edward was raised in the Protestant faith. We know that the same Thomas Cranmer, who played an active role in the Reformation of the Church and was directly involved in the divorce of the king, had a huge influence on him. Under Edward, Protestantism in England indeed moves forward. While Henry VIII did not consider himself a Protestant, he rather saw himself as a Catholic who simply did not submit to the Pope. Under Edward and Thomas Cranmer, England becomes truly Protestant. The Bible begins to be translated, a Protestant prayer book is introduced, and so on. It is often believed that this young boy king was forced by his guardians. Well, it's clear that when he was 10 years old, when he had just ascended to the throne, he hardly made many decisions, but we certainly know that he was a truly convinced Protestant and acted later, when he grew up, genuinely out of his own inner motivations. It can be assumed that Elizabeth Tudor, who was also raised in the Protestant faith her entire life, was profoundly affected by all these extremes. Therefore, she would never be fanatical in matters of religion. In June 1553, realizing that death was near, Edward wished to pass the crown to Lady Jane, her male heir, who was his second cousin once removed on his father's side, being only fourth in line to the throne. After this, strange events begin to unfold. So Edward had two half-sisters left, the two daughters of Henry VIII, Mary from the first marriage and Elizabeth. And it was such a very strange decision. But Edward knows that Lady Jane Grey is a staunch Protestant. She is married to a staunch Protestant, and her father-in-law is a very convinced Protestant. And so they will not let each other down. But Sister Mary, a Catholic, and the wavering Protestant Elizabeth Tudor could throw all of Edward's reforms to the wind. However, despite Edward's efforts to legitimize Lady Jane Grey's position, she was never crowned. From the moment her ascension to the throne was announced until her imprisonment in the Tower, she ruled for only 9 days. The eldest daughter of Henry VIII, Mary Tudor, carried out a swift and successful coup, and easily overthrew her. Ascending to the throne at the age of 37, Mary became the first female ruler in the history of England. Before her, the closest to the throne was only Henry I's daughter, Matilda, to whom her father bequeathed the crown in 1135. It seemed that for the English it was much more important to have a monarch descended from Henry VIII than a Protestant on the throne. On August 3rd, Mary, the future Mary I of England, but for now simply Mary Tudor, enters London. It is very characteristic that her younger sister enters with her. They are similar. It is clear that they act as allies, working together. However, perhaps Mary simply did not want to let Elizabeth out of her sight. But in any case, Mary begins to passionately desire to nullify her father's scholarly break with the Catholic Church. But for some reason, she does not restore the monasteries. In any case, she engages in long negotiations with the Pope, who is generally interested in when the monasteries will return, when the monks will be back in their places, and when the abbeys will be restored. However, Mary understands perfectly well that all these lands have already been sold to private individuals. This means that if she were to start reclaiming them now, it would cause an incredible uproar. Anne reaches an agreement, Catholicism is restored, and the lands remain confiscated. Being the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, she feels half Spanish and quickly arranges her own marriage to Philip II, the son of her powerful cousin, Charles V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. At that time in Spain, Philip was already serving as regent, suffering from his father's gout, and would soon be crowned as Philip II, ruler of Spain, the Spanish Netherlands, Spanish territories in the Habsburgs, and in Italy, as well as, of course, the New World. In the early days of her reign, Mary Tudor hoped that by marrying a husband, she could nullify and deflect the attacks from those who fundamentally disagreed with recognizing a woman on the throne. However, the choice she made had the opposite effect. According to the marriage agreement, Philip II was assigned the role of consort king. Although nominally he had no rights to patronage, could not participate in the development of defense or foreign policy, make appointments, or spend crown money. In reality, he soon easily mastered all these rights in practice. And although he spent most of his time in Brussels, he managed to participate in the politics of England. Mary begins to enforce the laws on heresy quite harshly. She persecutes those who do not comply, those who wish to return to the old faith. The 16th century was known for Catholic martyrs during Edward's reign and Protestant martyrs during Mary Thorne's reign, and so many prominent figures of the Elizabethan era leave England at that moment, precisely because of these religious persecutions. They emigrate to Switzerland, Venice, and the German Protestant lands to escape the wrath of Mary I of England. Elizabeth is forced to remain in England and continues to stay at court, despite the deteriorating relations with Mary I of England. During the 5 years of Mary I of England's reign, Elizabeth literally walks on a knife's edge, unsure of how the Queen and her subjects feel about her. Mary Tudor's husband Philip is her full co-sovereign. In ceremonial portraits, he occupies a more prestigious position than Mary, to the right of the Queen, under the shared crown. But everything changes when Philip II drags the country into an unpopular war against France, and Mary Tudor's multiple pregnancies turn out to be false. As a result, the Queen's authority collapses. The English, in general, did not understand Mary Tudor's decision to marry a foreigner. This leads to a rebellion. It is somewhat unclear, as a certain Thomas Wyatt raises a rebellion and moves with the rebels towards London, expecting that many others will join him. However, his uprising collapses literally before his eyes. He is arrested, interrogated, and then, of course, executed. In particular, the question arises as to whether he was connected to Elizabeth. Because yes, of course, the reason for the uprising was Mary's marriage, but didn't he want to overthrow Mary and place Elizabeth on the throne? And this question seems to linger in the air among Mary Tudor's loyal advisors. The fate of Elizabeth is certainly hanging by a thread, but after all, this is England. At one point, Mary Tudor might have been inclined to execute Elizabeth, but she was convinced that there was no longer any evidence against her. How could this be? During those very years, Ivan the Terrible would not have hesitated to deliberate much. By the way, they were contemporaries, as we know. Ivan the Terrible even once proposed to Elizabeth. However, Elizabeth is ultimately imprisoned in the Tower. Here, by the way, she is simultaneously in the Tower with Count Robert Dudley, who later seems to become the love of her life. And perhaps this rapprochement happened precisely when they were sitting together here in the Tower, but we will discuss it with you a little later. Elizabeth was just over 20 when she realized that her involvement in political affairs, the consequences of which could be potentially explosive, should be kept well hidden. And the day after the instigator was accused of treason, a whole delegation of advisors from Mary I of England appeared before Elizabeth with the intention of arresting her and of course charging her with complicity in the rebellion. One day, the stage managers wondered why Elizabeth travelled from Hertfordshire to her castle in Dunnington in Berkshire, the custodian of which was one of Wyatt's closest friends. However, it was not possible to prove that Elizabeth personally ordered the relocation or supported the uprising. Communication between her and Wyatt was conducted through third parties, and if it did occur, Elizabeth managed to shift the blame onto her subordinates. And this lesson Elizabeth learned very well. Until the end of her life, her favorite Latin expression would remain, "I see and keep silence." A year later, Elizabeth is released, but placed under house arrest outside of London. After all, it was impossible to deal with her while Mary I of England had no heir. Elizabeth is still her closest relative. If she is executed like this, if she is completely removed from political life, then who will be the next heir? There are plenty of relatives, but who will actually rule? And here another fateful twist of circumstances occurs. In 1558, Mary Tudor announces her pregnancy. In reality, she dies from a benign pituitary tumor. Only her closest relatives mourn her. Knowing that the time for Mary I of England had come, Philip II sent an envoy to England, Count Feria, seeking to protect Spain's interests and, just in case, to propose to Elizabeth. After all, one sister has left this world. Why not try to marry the second one to ensure England is not lost? However, the meeting between the ambassador and the future queen was brief, during which he managed to conclude that Elizabeth is vain and intelligent. She openly states that it is the duty of the people to occupy their lower position. She is determined that no one will rule over her. Princess Elizabeth intended from the very beginning to show what she is worth. However, it is easier said than done. It would be a great mistake to think that a woman at that time could rule solely on the basis of having a crown placed on her head. As the first unmarried queen in the history of the country, Elizabeth quickly felt that she was on the fringes of both the male and female worlds. Elizabeth enters London with incredible pomp. She is greeted by a crowd of people, and thus begins her long reign. Here it is, the Elizabethan era, which will last from 1558 to 1603. During this time, Elizabeth certainly managed to accomplish a great deal. In the early 16th century, England was a deeply patriarchal society where women, even those of royal blood, were considered dependent on men. Elizabeth's contemporaries did not believe that a woman's high status could be in any way more important than her gender, but Elizabeth believed that women should not be dependent on men, but rather men should be dependent on women. Elizabeth's contemporaries did not believe that a woman's high status could in any way be more important than her gender. But Elizabeth did not believe a woman's high status was more important than her gender. She wielded her weapon, her language. She understood the connection between words and power as she did. Since the convening of her first parliament, she has rebuffed all accusations proclaiming "my people" on my behalf. Of course, the ability to present herself in public did not stem from her acquaintance with ordinary people, whom she often lacked time for and regularly mentioned in court. These were studies in classical rhetoric and, of course, an impressive body of knowledge. It is worth mentioning her education. She loved to learn, mastered Latin, though not brilliantly, but knew Greek, and was passionate about languages throughout her life. She spoke French so fluently that the French themselves did not suspect she was a foreigner. She also studied Spanish, Italian, and German. Elizabeth's teacher, Roger Ascham, a man educated in the humanist tradition, chose the motto, "Knowledge is a refuge from fears." And this is very important for understanding the atmosphere in which Elizabeth grew up and her complex nature. In addition to her sharp mind and education, Elizabeth had another rare quality, the ability to choose her assistants. Often, talented rulers cannot tolerate bright personalities around them, and this, of course, affects their reign. Elizabeth surrounded herself with a proud group of outstanding individuals, among whom Lord Cecil, Baron Burghley, particularly stood out. He did a great deal to strengthen the royal authority and unite the lands under the rule of Elizabeth. However, of course, not everything is so simple in the relationships with her advisors and the Privy Council. In the first year of her reign, the Queen's Prime Minister reprimanded her secretary for raising the issue of religion in a private conversation with the Queen. In his opinion, it would be better if I did not discuss with Her Royal Majesty Stoling complicated subjects that are excessive for a woman's understanding, the secretary later wrote. Elizabeth will only possess real political power in the second half of her reign, by which time she will have managed to rein in the patriarchal lords. The psychological difficulties of Elizabeth Fern as a ruler become more apparent to us when we imagine her court. The personal chambers were significantly expanded through the efforts of her father and grandfather. Henry VIII arranged several separate rooms, the funds for which were raised during the aforementioned Reformation. This labyrinth of rooms was filled with masterpieces of art, but men and political figures no longer had access to them. Under Elizabeth I, this space became predominantly female, which of course politically weakened the Queen. Unlike her father and grandfather, she could not quickly gather advisors to discuss state affairs. For this, she had to schedule official audiences. Henry VIII lived and worked in a male environment, and trusted servants could come to him at any time of day or night, as long as he was not sleeping. For Elizabeth the Stars, it was absolutely unthinkable for a man, except for her personal physician, to enter her presence when she was in her nightgown or cap, or when her hair was being styled and her makeup applied. It is also important to note that she was characterized by her iron discipline. She knew how to use her time effectively and demanded the same from her subjects. Breakfast was modest, often consisting of bread, fruits, and a small amount of meat or fish. Elizabeth, I preferred light food in the morning so that she would not feel heavy during work. After breakfast, official receptions and meetings began. The Queen received advisors, diplomats, and ambassadors, discussed state affairs, and made important decisions. Her office was always filled with documents, letters, and reports that she personally studied carefully. The main part of her day was dedicated to managing the country. But of course, in the evening she found relief in balls and feasts. The masquerade balls at the court of Elizabeth I were particularly exquisite and captivating events, incorporating elements of theatre, music, and dance. These events allowed guests to temporarily forget about reality and immerse themselves in an atmosphere of mystery and fun, wearing masks and costumes to conceal their true identities. One of the most famous balls and masquerades held at the court of Elizabeth then was the ball in honor of the visit of the French ambassador. In 1572, this ball was organized to strengthen Anglo-French relations. The theme of the ball was ancient mythology. The hall was decorated in the style of ancient Rome, with columns, statues of gods and goddesses. Guests were invited to dress as characters from ancient myths and legends. Elizabeth I, however, wore a costume of the goddess Diana, symbolizing purity and power in one figure. The court guests were also dressed as nymphs, fauns, and titans. The masks were crafted with great sophistication, inlaid with precious stones, adorned with feathers. The evening began with a grand costume parade, followed by dancing and, of course, an impressive fireworks display that symbolized the triumph of the magicians over chaos. On the lavish table, roasted pheasants, prepared peacocks, and swans were served, sometimes even roasted badger and pies with live birds inside. Wine flowed like a river, and the feast continued late into the night. This masquerade ball was not only a celebration, it even aided in politics and strengthened relations between England and France. For Elizabeth then, such events were also a way to showcase her strength and sophistication, maintaining the image of a wise and powerful ruler. Elizabeth I was ambiguous about her infamous cousin Mary Stuart, whom she referred to as her sister. In general, when it came to blood ties, religion and politics took a back seat for her. In 1561, she informed Mary's advisor that in the event of her death, it would be Mary who would have the right to the English throne. However, Elizabeth I was strongly influenced by her advisors. Burghley and Boleyn convinced Protestants who believed in the special role of Protestant England. Fearing conspiracies instigated by Philip I, the Pope, and Catholics, they decided to do everything possible to ensure that the throne would definitely pass to a Protestant. To this end, they were even willing to adopt the necessary parliamentary laws and, if needed, to pressure the Queen. In 1568, a military crisis engulfed almost all of Europe. Mary Stuart, the Catholic heir to the throne, found herself on English soil, although she initially fled to her cousin seeking political asylum, and even as an honored guest. In Paris at this time, exiled Catholics are making plans to carry out the papal decree for the overthrow of Elizabeth the Fars. It is also a time when the Queen's secret council had reason to sound the alarm. There were assassination attempts. Furthermore, Walsingham uncovered more than one large-scale conspiracy from the relatives of Queen Mary, a powerful and wealthy French family, the de Izos. For Walsingham and Burghley, everything that was happening seemed to have emerged from a nightmare, so they ultimately decided to see the matter of Mary Stuart's execution through to the end without wasting a single second. They decided to pass a relevant document through Parliament, which had far-reaching consequences, as now the hand of retribution could reach absolutely any of Elizabeth I's potential successors. Any plan in the interests of the Stuarts, the direct heirs to the crown, that posed a threat to the life of Elizabeth I could now lead to the scaffold for Mary and James VI, regardless of whether they were aware of this plan or not. Postponing the question of the execution of Mary, for 19 years under the immense pressure from Burghley, Elizabeth III ultimately signs the death warrant for her cousin, the crowned and anointed Queen Mary Stuart. Then, of course, she quickly orders him to be recalled But Burghley, not wasting a moment, has already sent messengers to put it into action, not informing the Queen about it. As a result, on the fateful day, Elizabeth I set out to meet with the Portuguese diplomat, and thus, she was almost the last at court to learn of Mary's death. The execution took place on February 8, 1587. For almost 20 years, Elizabeth I postponed the decision, but the execution ultimately took place. Unfortunately, the executioner lost his nerve. He could not shake the thought that the woman before him was the anointed queen, and his hands trembled. As a result, he was only able to fulfill his duty on the third attempt. Maria died in agony. Who benefited from this? But Burghley, having achieved his main goal of excluding the Catholic Mary from the list of claimants to the throne, also brilliantly demonstrated that male advisors at the court of a female monarch can act against her will when she shows indecisiveness. But Burghley also did not come out of this story unscathed. Elizabeth I banished him from the court, and their relationship never returned to its former state. Elizabeth I cruelly humiliated Burghley, teaching him a lesson he would never forget. She is no longer the inexperienced girl he could manipulate, now she is his queen. And in any case, she is not just a woman whose opinion can be disregarded. Under Elizabeth III, an impressive navy was established. Although it had not yet reached the greatness of future centuries when Britain would become the mistress of all seas, the fleet was already quite powerful. Elizabeth, like many of her time, relied not only on her navy but also on privateers. Essentially pirates who attacked her enemies. The most famous among all these pirates was of course Francis Drake, whose name instilled fear in the Spanish colonies. This cruel and generally half-mad man accomplished many remarkable feats, including the second circumnavigation of the globe. The first, as we know, was Magellan. While Drake initially had no such plans, he merely wanted to raid the Spanish colonies on the Atlantic coast of America. But he was pursued so relentlessly that he had to flee, passing south of America. That is why there is Drake Passage next to the Strait of Magellan. Under Elizabeth III, England became a powerful state, although she generally preferred to avoid aggressive wars and assessed her position. As the ruler of an island nation with a clear perspective, there were several unsuccessful campaigns in France and the Netherlands, initiated, by the way, by her favorites, but overall she preferred to defend her island and not to stick her neck out. Elizabeth I successfully repelled attacks each time, which was especially important after the execution of Mary Stuart, when Philip II began preparing a powerful invasion of England. Spain planned a land invasion rather than a war at sea. On Friday, July 19th, the first Spanish ships were spotted in Cornwall, but by chance, Francis Drake and Coward were nearby. According to legend, the very same Drake was playing bowls at that moment. Upon hearing the alarming news, he, of course, finished his game. Elizabeth I immediately declared mobilization. And although the English ships were smaller and had fewer cannons, they were still more maneuverable, which proved decisive in the battle. I won't go into the details of this battle as war is not particularly interesting to me, but the main point we need to mention is that the Armada was defeated. The high maneuverability of the English ships and the experience of Elizabeth I's captains played a significant role. On the other hand, the storm and generally very bad weather certainly affected the Spanish. The English would later say that the Protestant wind had interrogated the Spanish ships, and a famous medal would even be issued with this inscription, "God blew and they scattered." A famous armorial portrait of Elizabeth I will also be painted, where she sits majestically in the guise of a victorious queen, with scenes of naval battles in the background and a globe in his right hand. It is possible that the matter, of course, was not solely due to divine providence. To boost morale, Elizabeth I was persuaded to visit the military camp in Tilbury to inspect the troops. The drama of the moment was meticulously planned. To create for her the image of a warrior queen, which she never truly was, the outcome exceeded all expectations. After inspecting the troops, Elizabeth the Young delivered a speech that still sparks debate among historians. There are at least 6 versions of her famous speech, but the key phrase, of course, remains unchanged. "I have the body of a weak and fragile woman, but the heart and guts of a king, the King of England, and I laugh at every reckless ruler of Europe who dares to invade the borders of my kingdom." The The soldiers greeted her with united shouts of love and loyalty. The victory seemed absolutely unquestionable, but the joy quickly turned into disappointment. The soldiers who had recently praised the Queen soon began to curse her, as they did not receive the promised reward and pay. The invincible armada of Philip II was completely defeated. On August 3rd, 2 weeks before the camp in Tilbury was disbanded, the Earl of Leicester sent a touching letter to Elizabeth III, addressing her as "my dearest lady." A month later, he died in the arms of his wife Letitia from a 3-day fever at the age of 55. Who was this Earl of Leicester, and why was he so important to Elizabeth Mean? The Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley, was the love of Elizabeth's life. If she had decided to marry, she would have chosen only him. An athletic build, tall stature, a slender figure, piercing, grey-blue eyes, and wavy chestnut hair. It was this type of beauty that Elizabeth I admired. Their relationship had lasted almost 40 years at that point, beginning in childhood when Elizabeth I was a 9-year-old girl. A month after her ascension to the throne, the ambassador of King Philip II of Spain noted that Dudley was second only to Lord Burleigh in status. Elizabeth thus also loved to give her friends nicknames. Burleigh was her grey spirit, Walsingham was her Moor, and Robert was her timid, sweet Robin, or her precious eyes. Elizabeth I hardly concealed her feelings for Robert Dudley, and in 1560 Nicholas Throckmorton reported to Burghley scandalous rumours about their intimate relationship upon entering France, further complicated by the fact that Robert was married. Many believe that Elizabeth I allowed Robert to have too much hope and to aspire to marriage. But despite the rumours, when the Queen thought she was dying from smallpox, she declared that although she loved Robert, there had never been anything inappropriate between them. Few, however, believed this. The situation was further exacerbated by rumours that Dudley was simply waiting for his wife's death to marry Elizabeth I. He parted ways with Emmy immediately after the coronation of Elizabeth I, and he only visited her occasionally, receiving instructions from the Queen not to do anything with or for her. Only the black ones, the news of Amy Dudley's mysterious death on September 8, 1560, caused universal shock. She was found with a broken neck and wounds on her head. It was assumed that she had fallen from a stone staircase. Robert immediately found himself under suspicion of murder and was forced to make tremendous efforts to prove his innocence. Despite the official conclusion of an accident, there remained a certain ambiguity in the case and, of course, suspicion. Still hoped to marry Elizabeth I, but her instinct for self-preservation ultimately prevailed, and suggested that such a union threatened her throne. This is important for us and shows that Elizabeth I was primarily a pragmatic monarch, rather than a girl swayed by emotions. Despite her passionate love for Robert, Elizabeth I soon after her coronation clearly stated her intention to remain single. She said that she happily chooses the life she lives, which completely satisfies her up to this moment. She also added that in the end, she would be satisfied if her gravestone simply stated that the Queen lived and died a virgin. She will skillfully exploit this image throughout her entire political career. The image of the Virgin Queen was first captured during the Norwich festivities, and by 1590, this image had become a true cult of Gloriana. At that time, the famous Ditchley portrait was painted, depicting Elizabeth I as a powerful monarch, although no longer a young girl. In this image, the Queen became the embodiment of the Virgin Queen, the priestesses of the goddess Vesta and the divine figure simultaneously. As a Vestal Virgin, she symbolized purity and simultaneous allure. And as a goddess, the Virgin Mother, the second Madonna, impervious to both time and aging. Elizabeth had serious doubts about marriage her whole life. It is not surprising for us, considering that her father executed her mother, accusing her of various infidelities, incest, and of course, due to the traumatic events she experienced during her teenage years with her stepmother Catherine Parr. After the death of her father Henry VIII, Catherine Parr married Thomas Seymour, the uncle of King Edward. Thomas was very popular at court and often visited young Elizabeth in her rooms in the mornings. He would come before she had a chance to get up and even get dressed, wish her a good morning, sometimes pat her on the back or on the bottom, and then leave for his own business. Another incident that earned a bad reputation occurred when Parr and Seymour divorced in the garden with Elizabeth. and Seymour cut her dress into hundreds of pieces of black fabric while a couple held her. Soon, rumors of an intimate relationship between Thomas and Elizabeth spread widely in society. The future queen endured this scandal, but it changed her forever. She had to grow up quickly, as it was particularly humiliating to deny the claim of pregnancy from Seymour. Elizabeth insisted that such a shameful and slanderous connection deeply offended both her honor and dignity, but she never forgot about this incident again. During her 20 years on the throne, Elizabeth was offered the hand of about 30 suitors, including, of course, Philip and Eric, the King of Sweden. All marriage negotiations failed for various reasons, including, of course, the advisor's desire to choose a husband for the Queen. The last contender was a Frenchman, the Duke of Anjou, representing a whole generation of French kings. These marriage negotiations faced numerous obstacles, for a variety of reasons, including, of course, the advisor's desire to choose a husband for the Queen, predictions what she and Elizabeth in general certainly did not like. In the winter of 1581-1582, Elizabeth pretended to flirt with the Duke of Anjou, trying to charm the Frenchman, and called him "my little frog." She even gave him a symbolic ring and announced their engagement, but only after his persistent requests. At that time, King Henry III of France threatened not to support her against Spain if she did not marry his brother, but Elizabeth still refused him. After the Duke's departure, there were even rumors around London that Elizabeth danced with joy, happy to be rid of him. It is widely acknowledged that the Earl of Leicester often remarked in Birddale that if the Queen ever decided to marry, she would choose only him. In the court, Elizabeth was often seen giving him kisses. And in 1564, when she made him the Earl of Leicester, French and Scottish ambassadors noticed how she affectionately tickled his chin and even kissed him publicly. In 1575, anticipating the Queen's visits, Leicester displayed their joint portrait for public view, where they were depicted together as husband and wife, which provoked a storm of criticism. But Elizabeth humorously countered that their relationship was like that of relatives, a brother and sister. However, the gossip certainly did not cease. Catholics continued to spread rumors about the alleged illicit affair of the Queen. The rumors only multiplied, and in 1573, Leicester organized a grand celebration for Elizabeth full of revelry, and of course, theatrical performances, which she loved so much, the courtiers whispered, and the ambassadors wrote reports about their closeness. Elizabeth, skillfully playing on the edge, maintained the intrigue and never gave direct answers, leaving everyone guessing. As her reign came to an end, in the last decades, Elizabeth I completely relinquished control over the socio-economic processes in the country. The summer of 1593 was the hottest and driest of the 16th century. In London alone, 18,000 people died that year, which was about 1/10 of the city's population, and of those, approximately 2/3 died from the plague. Soon, Elizabeth I also experienced several bouts of deep depression. The worst period of this epidemic coincided with the sudden decision of Henry IV of Navarre to convert to Catholicism, which is associated with the famous phrase "Paris is worth a mass," and which Elizabeth I perceived as a personal betrayal. She lived in great luxury, was pampered, cared for, and all her whims were satisfied, with the funds for this coming from taxes and revenues from the Crown's land excises. She consumed resilient products that were purchased at local markets at artificially low prices by royal prerogative. The Queen spent her days in the gilded world of her palaces, fearing the public. At that time, Elizabeth I had already lived longer than any English monarch since Edward III, and still, the discontent of her advisors refused to name the successor. Incurable insomnia, along with migraines, severe depression, and sharp mood swings defined her condition during that period. Her neck and cheeks were already wrinkled, her teeth had yellowed, and there was hardly any of her own hair left on her head. Like Mary Stuart, Elizabeth I used chignons from the age of 13 and later wore wigs. To hide the wrinkles on her neck, she wore a high, starched muslin ruff, or elaborate pearl necklaces, and of course, jewelry with precious stones and gold collars. To hide her teeth, she sometimes placed a silk-scented handkerchief in her mouth, and also, wishing to appear taller, she ordered her shoemaker Peter Johnson to make the first officially documented high-heeled shoes inspired by the Italian fashion of that time. The famous color of her skin, an ivory shade, was achieved by having her maids wash her face 3 times a week with a special liquid made from egg whites, a solution of quicksilver, sea salt, camphor oil, olive juice, and opium poppy seeds mixed in spring water. The ointments that supported the myth of the pristine freshness of her skin contained white lead, vinegar, turpentine, and mercury. Lips and cheeks were given a red color using toxic and caustic additives. Some types of cloves severely irritated the skin and mucous membranes. The substances used for many years were, of course, the cause of allergic reactions, skin diseases, and memory problems, and subsequently disturbances in sensory perception. Descriptions of the oldest queen strikingly coincide with a recently discovered image of Elizabeth I by the artist of the workshop of Marcus Gerards the Younger. In this portrait, she is 62 or 63 years old. The portrait turned out to be a rare find. The very existence of such a portrait contradicts the popular theory that, in her old age, the image-conscious queen ordered the destruction of all realistic representations of herself. It is believed that Elizabeth I's favorite image was, after all, the so-called Mask of Youth, from a series of paintings by Nicholas Hilliard, whose workshop created about 20 miniatures in this style starting from 1994. This refers to a portrait that in no way reveals the queen's age. On the contrary, her face is intentionally endowed with features and characteristics typical of a 20-30-year-old girl. Nevertheless, in conclusion, we must remember that Elizabeth I achieved truly remarkable political stability for her time during her reign. Elizabeth ascended to the throne during a period of serious religious and political issues, upheavals, and managed to stabilize the country by establishing Anglicanism as the state religion, which in turn contributed to a reduction in religious conflicts. Also, despite the stratification of society, the economy of England strengthened during the reign of Elizabeth I. The development of trade, especially with America and Asia, contributed to the growth of the middle class. And an increase in state revenue, as well as, undoubtedly, a cultural flourishing. English culture and art were at their peak during the time of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and many other outstanding writers and poets who created their masterpieces. Thus, Elizabeth I never married, did not give birth to an heir, and left this world in the guise of a virgin. She passed away on March 24, 1603, at the age of 69. And with her, absolutism also faded into the past, as it had become unsuitable for the Industrial Revolution that was knocking at the door. The Tudor dynasty ended with Elizabeth I, the continuation of which her father Henry VIII had so passionately dreamed of. With her departure, the Scottish Stuarts ascended to the throne, leading to the unification of the two states. Even in her death, Elizabeth I benefited England. Dear friends, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please share your thoughts in the comments, as well as the names of the heroes you would like to see in future videos. Until we meet again.